Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to today's program. It's going to be a two-week series on a very important topic, reporting on the 9/11 Commission. As you viewers know, that terrible crime took place on September 11th, 2001, and almost 3,000 individuals lost their lives in New York City, in the Twin Towers, and in Washington, D.C., at the Pentagon, and also on the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. Following this awful crime, there was a Public Law 107-306 that was passed in 2002. The Congress and the President agreed that we should have a 9/11 Commission. 10 members were appointed to that commission, headed by Thomas Kean, who was the past governor of New Jersey, and the vice chair was Lee Hamilton, a former congressman from Indiana, one a Republican, one a Democrat. There were 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans on the commission. It was truly bipartisan, and their work has received raving praise from many sources for how diligent they were, both in trying to identify where the security problems had been, and most important, how we might deal with protecting our society in the future with recommendations. They have sent speakers around the country, and we've been very fortunate to have on our campus one of those highly qualified individuals, and she will be with us this week and next week. Our guest is Erin Smith. She is the senior assistant to the president of the 9/11 Discourse Project, which followed the commission to go around the country to talk about this very important subject. She graduated with high honors from Truman State University, and she speaks nationally to students in particular, as she has at our campus at North Idaho College at the time of the taping of this program. Our guest holds a BS degree in political science, and she worked for a summer as a research assistant at Harvard University. Another one of her many honors, and she certainly has a long list of them, she was twice chosen as the top student at her campus, and also she was honored by Glamour magazine as one of the top 12 women in this country while in college. Ms. Smith, welcome to the program. It's great having you here and speaking to our community and also being on this program.
Thank you for inviting me. I've had a wonderful trip so far to North Idaho College, and I want to especially thank you, Tony, for all of your work in setting this up and inviting me on today's program.
It's a pleasure having you here, and I'm pleased to have our 2 regular panelists, Janelle Burke and Erna Reinhardt, and Janelle will ask the first question.
This is a very important topic, and I think most of our viewers can remember exactly where they were when they heard about the September 11th events. Can you tell us, please, about the 9/11 Commission report and that first section of the report which deals with the nation transformed and what exactly happened?
The first chapter of the 9/11 report is really something that makes the report unique, in the sense that it is a government report, but it was written with the mindset that normal people, that average Americans who aren't involved in necessarily public policy or foreign policy or intelligence communities should be able to and be interested in reading this. And so the entire report was written in a narrative form, telling stories about things, rather than starting with the history of terrorism and the history of Islam and other things that might provide background for it. Chapter 1 starts with the hijackers of the 9/11 planes walking through the airport. And it describes what they were doing. It talks a little bit about things that gives Americans more background on things. CAPS is one of those, computer-assisted passenger pre-screening system. They are in the process of coming up with a replacement for that. It talks about things that do give background information and research about these topics, but making it presented in a way that's interesting to people. So the first chapter of this report goes through a timeline of that morning, of the very confusing day of September 11th, 2001. And it talks about some very heroic stories of people who worked outside of the box and thought outside of convention to help make things happen. One good example of that are individual FAA controllers who had the unprecedented task of doing an entire nationwide ground stop that had really never happened before, and they had to go away from their training manuals and away from their books to make that happen. Unfortunately, though, there are lots of examples that are documented in Chapter 1 of that day of things that didn't happen well, of failures to communicate between agencies, of the problems between the FAA communicating with NORAD, who is responsible for defending the airspace above the United States and Canada. Lots of examples of missed opportunities, of delays, of people's calls not getting to the right people at the same time. But those deficiencies are important to point out, because when we start to look at this from an objective point of view, which was the 9/11 Commission's goal, to find out what were the facts of the day and how can we piece together by interviewing so many people. The Commission interviewed 1,200 people all at all different levels to find out exactly how can we get the most information together to figure out what happened that day. So some good stories, some bad stories. The general theme, I think, you'll find of Chapter 1 is confusion, not knowing really what to do. There wasn't a precedent for this. There were a lot of people who did what they could, but there were some huge failures, as we've seen, by the deaths that were caused by the people working in the World Trade Center towers, people in the Pentagon, and then the passengers on all 4 planes, including the one, Flight 93 from United, that was eventually forced to crash in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Erna Reinhardt.
Erin, welcome to the show. It's nice to have you on our campus, and it's great to do a TV show with you. Share with us, one of the things that the Commission does, the report does, is summarizes all of those destructive things that did happen that day, and share with our viewers, because some of our viewers were probably a little bit younger when this actually happened. Share with us what the extent of that damage was that day.
The extent of the damage, I think most people think about it in 2 different ways. It damaged our country in multiple ways. The most important to me is the deaths of the people that day, about 3,000 victims. That includes workers in the World Trade Center towers. There was a very low rate of survival of the floors above where the 2 planes hit, both the North and the South towers. And that's another thing we talk about in the emergency response chapter, is the procedures for evacuation, or the lack of procedures for evacuation, and the confusion in terms of whether people would have had a better chance of survival if better preparedness programs had been in place. So certainly the people who were at work that day in the World Trade Center towers, that comprised the bulk of the casualties that day. Other people, both military and civilian, inside the Pentagon, and then of course passengers, crews, and pilots from 4 flights, 2 from American and 2 from United, all of whom were hijacked that day. The other 2, I think, big symbols that people think of today are the World Trade Center tower structures themselves. They really were a defining part of the skyscape of Manhattan. They, for a lot of people, provided a symbol to America's economy and to America's system of capitalism and our wealth as a country, which is one of the reasons we believe they were targeted. That, of course, is gone today, and there are efforts to reconstruct either World Trade Center towers or Freedom Park, and that's an issue that we don't deal with directly, but it of course relates to what we do. But one of the things that people don't think about as much, at least at the superficial level, is the economic destruction that was caused that day. Business continuity is an important part of preparedness for terrorism. So having redundant sites so that people who are affected by a terrorist attack or another catastrophe can still have a place to make their business keep going. It's important to see that the economy is still going to continue even if something bad happens to our country. The stock prices and other things are, of course, going to be affected by this kind of thing. The best thing that we can do, besides trying to prevent these kind of attacks, is trying to show how resilient we can be if something were to happen. So it affected us on a lot of different areas. I think if anything good came of it, it was a national resolve to do something about this. I'm sure people remember that in the days and the weeks and the months following 9/11, there was a great unity of spirit of the American people. All of a sudden, all the cars you saw decorated had decorations of American flags, and people were singing patriotic songs, and they were going to rallies, and they really wanted to know what they could do to help rally around this event. So, of course, we wouldn't say that this was a positive event, but some things like unity of spirit and like the willingness to do what it takes, both at the individual level and as a country, legislation and other things like that, this has really been a catalyzing event for those changes to happen.
Great.
I have 2 areas I want to go into, Erin, with you. First of all, it was mentally hard for us to believe this could ever happen in our country, and so that would explain some of the reasons why that certain security might not have obviously been preparing for that, because we just didn't comprehend this happening. In the report, it talks about a heading, not a surprise, in one sense the word, but another one a shock, because in 1993 there was an attack upon the World Trade Center, and bin Laden's Al-Qaeda group in August 1998 did the bombings in Kenya and Tanzania of our embassies. And then in October 2000, the USS Cole was attacked. What does the report of the Commission say about, there were a lot of signs of this terrible terrorist activity going on in both in our country and abroad, with the examples I gave. How does the Commission address that?
Well, you said the exact phrase that we use, and that is that it was a shock, but that it should not have been a surprise. I think many times Americans think of September 11th, 2001 as the first terrorist attack, but as you mentioned, there were many before that, and even some that you did mention and that you didn't. In 1984, the Marine barracks were attacked. That was years before September 11th, obviously. In 1993, the World Trade Centers were attacked. 2001 wasn't the first terrorist attempt on those buildings. And the 1993 World Trade Center attacks were actually an interesting case study because it was mostly orchestrated by two men. Yusuf was a nephew of one of the masterminds behind the 9/11 attacks named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but this was his nephew who was 3 years his junior, and then another man named Salmeh. And they drove a bomb in a Ryder truck into the parking level garages of the World Trade Center tower. They blew a hole in it that was 6 or 7 stories tall. The level of casualties, though, was relatively low. There were only, I think, four or half a dozen maybe casualties from this. And there were reasons why we weren't paying attention at the time. One of them was because something else was going on that was really captivating our nation's attention, and that was the O.J. Simpson trial. So the World Trade Center was bombed. It didn't, while those deaths were tragic, the number of them was not great enough to divert our country's attention away from the O.J. Simpson trial and onto the World Trade Center towers. And then, in an almost comic fashion, the story that kept coming to light from those attacks was that the second man, the kind of right man, I guess, or right-hand man, kept going back to the rental truck facility to get his deposit back for the $300 that he had spent to rent the truck that they had then exploded. And because of some great detective work on behalf of the District of New York, they had found pieces of the VIN number and had determined that these were the people who had orchestrated this attack. So on the third or fourth time that he went back to Ryder to get his $300 deposit back from the truck that he had exploded, the authorities were waiting for him and they arrested him. Now, in a double-edged sword kind of irony, the success that New York had in prosecuting the two of them was good in the sense that they were able to point to the people who did it. But the flip side of that is that in the American people's minds, they were thinking, check, that's completed, that's done, we've taken care of that. Exactly, they had been caught. And then, as you mentioned, there was even things after that. In 1994, there were failed plots to bomb both the Holland and the Lincoln tunnels in New York. That never came to be. And then in 1998, it was very significant. It was U.S. interest, but it was abroad in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. They carried out simultaneous embassy attacks. And the difference there, I think, was that even though it was the United States that was attacked, because it was overseas, it was...
Their security wasn't as good as ours.
Exactly, or that it was less real to people because it was way over there across an ocean. It wasn't something that was happening in New York. And one of the things that the simultaneous embassy bombing showed us is exactly how coordinated this network was. It's a very fragmented network in the sense that it's composed of cells. Terrorist networks are composed of cells all over the place. But it's quite difficult, actually, to execute simultaneous attacks on two different places in two separate countries. And they were able to do that in 1998.
Another thing we've learned is that they're patient. There can be years between their attacks.
Absolutely. We talked about that today, actually, that the first proposal for what they call the Plains Operation, which we now know as the attacks on September 11th, was proposed by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to Osama bin Laden in 1996. So they do have the patience to plan these things, and Al-Qaeda is an organization that will take the time to plan this. 1996 was a proposal, 1998 was when they started planning, and of course 2001 was when they were executed.
One comment I'd like to make is I think it would be a very serious mistake in trying to analyze this and protect us for the future to start laying blame on either political party. It wasn't a party thing. I mean, there was a lot of things going without being giving certain attention, but that was not. In other words, we should be bipartisan and be supportive of how we deal with this, rather than trying to blame any particular person or group, because no one in government at the national level realized that this, or American people realized that it was going to be something of this magnitude. But now we've learned from that.
And that's both a praise and a criticism of the 9/11 report, is that it does not point out people, specific people, to blame for this. So our critics have said, you know, there were people who were at fault, and you should have listed their names and put them on the front cover and held people accountable for it. And people in support of this approach to things say that it's an important lesson to learn that it was systematic failures,
Right.
that it wasn't that it was one person or four people who were to blame for these events happening, as much as it was problems inherent in our systems that needed to be addressed at the systematic level. The other problem with naming specific people is that, as in the case with the first World Trade Center bombings in the early 1990s, if you assign blame to a specific number of people, and then those people are removed from office or are fired, then in the American people's minds, the problem is taken care of. When in reality, we think that we'll be dealing with this for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years or
As
longer.
far beyond any individual
Exactly.
or any administration.
Exactly.
Janelle Burke.
How do we identify these persons then? If this is such an insidious thing and it was going on, how do you identify who those folks are who might be the, quote, enemy?
That's a tough challenge, and it's something that our government is working on all sorts of levels. In retrospect, it's easy to identify the 19 hijackers of the 9/11 flights. Their pictures are listed on page 239 of our report. Because, of course, in retrospect, it's easy to check records and flight manifests and things like that. But that's exactly the challenge that we have now, is to find how can we root out these people and disrupt their networks. Sometimes what's easier than finding specific individuals' names is finding methods. We do target people individually. One of the ways we do that is by watch lists. That's another thing that was hugely faulty, though, before 9/11, was the lack of watch list sharing, in the sense that our intelligence organizations and our intelligence agencies had thousands of names of people who should not be allowed to fly on American commercial airliners. But when that was translated to the actual airlines, so the people who are standing at the airports that you and I go to and say yes or no, then the number was only a fraction of that, because of security concerns with sharing people's names and things like that. So watch listing is one way that we can use the information, exactly like you said, to find specific individuals and their names and their aliases and the other places they may live and the other places they may operate, to share those names so that we have a better understanding of who that is. Sometimes what's easier than looking for individual people is to look for methods. Two statements put out by the 9/11 Commission staff, one on terrorist travel and one on terrorist finance, talk about those methods. Terrorists have to be able to travel to do what they do. So if we are able to target things like how do they doctor their passports, or how do they fraudulate their visa information, then we're able to take away one leg that they stand on for making these operations happen. The same thing with terrorist financing. They have to have money to do this. Individual terrorist cells are relatively inexpensive to run, but the network requires a steady flow of money, because they have training, they need equipment, they have operations, they need to pay for travel for people back and forth, they have recruitment needs. I mean, it's the same as a lot of organization in that it takes money to run. So when we as the United States work with organizations and task forces that try to target things like money laundering and terrorist finance, we're able to better coordinate those efforts and try to target those things through the supplies and the methods that they rely on to do what they do.
Tell me, is it a cell or is it individuals just working on their own? How does this work? For someone who's as inexperienced or dense as I am, how does it work?
The best we know comes from intelligence information about that sometimes may be incomplete, but as best we can tell, terrorist networks often consist of small cells that can be very small. There's something in the 9/11 report called the Hamburg contingent, which was 4 people, 4 German students. They did have a larger group, but the 4 of them were the core people there. And then there are some cells that, like a training camp could be considered a cell that might have a couple hundred people there. So cells may operate with a wide range of either knowledge or ignorance about the other cells that they work with. They can be sent on missions to other organizations. They tend to use each other for supplies of resources, whether that's people who are willing to fund them or to underwrite their expenses, equipment, bomb-making materials, bomb-making expertise. Just because you have the materials doesn't mean you know how to put it together. And something that's sometimes, in some parts of the world, hard to come by is a supply of people who are willing to be suicide operatives. So by keeping them separate, it makes it harder for us to fight, because it's a new kind of war. And we've said that 100 times at least, that in the past, it's easy for us to see where our enemy is coming from, in the sense that they're coming from a country, they have things they want to protect, people, civilians, equipment, infrastructure, that kind of thing. But then what do you do then when it's not one country attacking another, but it's 3 guys in Rome who are in cahoots with 6 guys in Austria who may or may not know that they are being funded by a group of 50 people in Sudan somewhere. So it's disseminated enough that it's hard for us to pin it down, but they, in general, work together and try to find each other, and they're like-minded people who believe as strongly as they do about these fundamentalist views.
Erna Reinhardt.
Aaron, one of the things that the Commission did was identify specific areas of vulnerability for our country, and you've touched on a few of those, the tracking the hijackers and the list of people that people should have been watching. But another one of them that is of real concern and is also a real challenge is that sharing of information between the intelligence organizations. Could you share with us what the Commission found, and then share with us maybe what some of the recommendation about that specific topic might be?
Absolutely. If there are themes to the 9/11 report, one of them is certainly the lack of information sharing. And that's a hard thing to do, because this information is sensitive and it's important to protect it. But at the same time, if the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, then the entire body is having a hard time operating, which is what we found with a lot of what was going on. A lot of this is inter-agency, and a lot of it is intra-agency. It means that the 9/11 Commission found that not only was the CIA not always sharing information with the FBI, but that FBI agents in law enforcement weren't sharing information with FBI agents in intelligence, and that the FBI field agents weren't sharing information among themselves. And there were a lot of missed opportunities for that kind of thing. So what we did find was that the culture of these agencies was to protect information and to get as much information as they could, but to safely guard it for lots of different reasons, and then that culture kind of perpetuates itself. There were also some misunderstandings and misapplications of provisions and procedures, especially in the FBI and in other places, that led to mistaken beliefs by people like FBI field agents about whether they could or could not share information. One example is called FISA. It's Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It was an act passed back in Congress in 1978 that regulates how warrants can be enacted when intelligence gathering is directed at foreign powers. So FISA meant that there had to be court orders for this kind of thing, but because of a series of interpretations of this led to agents not believing that it wasn't encouraged to share, but that they weren't allowed to share this information because of the rules about prosecuting criminals and things like that. They didn't want their convictions to be overturned because of technicalities, so they started to become very guarded in how they were sharing this information. So one of the things that the 9/11 Commission recommended to overcome this was actually 2 things. The creation of the Office of Office of Director of National Intelligence, or the ODNI, is an organization that kind of encompasses all 15 intelligence agencies to ensure that there's one person who's looking out for all different types of intelligence gathering that we have. Lots of people think about the CIA as the only spying or espionage agency that we have, but there are actually 15 different agencies, and only when they work together are we most effective at that. So the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the newly created National Counterterrorism Center are 2 ways that those agencies are working with each other. At the NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, they have delegates from each of these agencies, so some people from the FBI, some people from DIA, some people from the NSA, who all work together and have daily meetings so that the one organization knows what the other one is doing. Sometimes duplication of effort is helpful, and sometimes it's a waste of resources. Sometimes information that one organization or one agency has is exactly the missing piece that another organization or entity needs. So we are making progress, but it's slow progress, because this is a very ingrained mentality and a very ingrained culture in these agencies and our executive branch that has realized the value of what they're doing, but are still trying to do it with a balance of national security in mind.
Fortunately, you'll be back next week too, but we only get so much information on the two programs. I'm going to have to put up the website now, and if you'd take just a moment for our viewers who would like to see this in more detail, there are two websites that they could view, if you would give those websites.
The first website is the 9/11 Commission's website. It's www.9-11commission.gov. This was the 9/11 Commission's website during their active investigation. It is a frozen website, so it doesn't change, but it's maintained by the National Archives for the purpose of scholars and researchers and interested people all over the United States to be able to access everything from the 9/11 report, which you can download for free, but you have to have 500 pages ready in your printer if you decide to print it out. Everything from that to the transcripts of hearings.
And then you have a second website.
The second website is the 9/11 Public Discourse Project's website, which is www.9-11pdp.org. The Public Discourse Project is the office I work for. It's the nonprofit follow-on to the 9/11 Commission report, whose mission is to educate people about the 9/11 Commission, its report, and the recommendations that they made.
We only have about a minute and a half left, but we can have a couple of more examples about, next week we'll get into recommendations, but one of the other problems was dealing with passports and visas, and also even some of the terrorists have been in this country to be, at some schools were trained how to fly planes, and have we learned from that?
Well, we have learned a little bit more about how they operate. One of the first things that terrorists are taught to do is how to, in the past, what they've been taught to do is how to alter their travel documents in the field. So in a hotel room or without necessarily all the equipment they need, how to take out stamps from countries that might be a red flag to customs people and to border people here to make it easier for them to travel back and forth between the two. They also did enroll in U.S. flight schools because they were less expensive and better schools than what they had found abroad. And I think that now we are more careful in investigating people's backgrounds and in following up on leads.
On that note, we have to bring the program to conclusion. I'm so sorry to do that. We'll continue next week with you. Thank you so much. And we'll also stress very much next week the 9/11 Commission's recommendations on how to make our country more safe, and hopefully this not happen again. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Erin Smith, and she is with the 9/11 Task Force, and we find it very informative. And we hope that you'll be with us again next week, and we will continue this discussion. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.